Between the great river of Egypt and the twin streams of Mesopotamia lay a narrow corridor of hills and valleys that would witness humanity's most consequential spiritual revolution. This land bridge, connecting 3 continents, bore many names across the millennia. The Egyptians called it Rechenu. The Mesopotamians knew it as Amuru, but history would remember it by the name given by one of its own peoples, Canaan, the land of purple dye traders who sailed their commerce across the Mediterranean's wine-dark waters. The geography itself seemed designed for conflict and convergence. Coastal plains stretched along the Mediterranean shore, fertile and inviting to settlers and invaders alike. Inland, limestone hills rose in parallel ridges, their slopes terraced for olive groves and vineyards. The Jordan River carved a deep rift through the landscape, creating a natural corridor from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea's bitter waters. Mountain peaks thrust skyward, Hermon in the north with its year-round snow, the central highlands where Jerusalem would one day crown a ridge, the wilderness of the Negev stretching south towards Sinai's ancient mysteries. This crossroads location proved both blessing and curse. Armies marched through Canaan's valleys as empires expanded and contracted. Merchants carried goods, languages, and ideas along the coastal highway connecting Africa and Asia. Cultural influences flowed like tributaries into a great river, creating a complexity that would define this small land's oversized role in human history. Long before Hebrew shepherds settled in these hills, Canaan hosted sophisticated urban civilizations. The early Bronze Age saw the first true cities rise from village settlements. Massive walls surrounded densely packed houses, workshops, temples, and grain storage facilities. At Ai, inhabitants constructed fortifications over 10 meters thick. Jericho's residents built walls enclosing nearly 10 acres, protecting perhaps 3,000 people within the settlement's defensive perimeter. These early cities developed complex societies with specialized crafts, long-distance trade networks, and social hierarchies. Copper tools gradually replaced stone implements. Potters shaped elegant vessels on fast-spinning wheels. Metal workers created bronze alloys that revolutionized agriculture and warfare. The wealth flowing through Canaanite cities attracted attention from the great powers emerging to the east and south. The most impressive of these Bronze Age centers was Hazor in the north. Covering over 200 acres at its peak, this metropolis commanded the vital crossroads where traders traveling between Mesopotamia and Egypt met merchants carrying goods from Anatolia and the Mediterranean coast. Massive earthen ramparts protected both the elevated citadel and the sprawling lower city. Within these defenses lived perhaps 20,000 inhabitants, making Hazor one of the ancient world's largest urban centers. Megiddo controlled another crucial junction where the coastal highway met the Jezreel Valley route into the Jordan Valley. Its position allowed rulers to tax caravans and control military movements through this strategic bottleneck. Archaeological layers at Megiddo reveal continuous occupation across millennia, with each generation building upon their predecessors' foundations. Canaanite temples, palaces, and water systems demonstrate sophisticated urban planning and engineering capabilities. Jerusalem, though less imposing than northern giants like Hazor, occupied a defensible hilltop position that would prove its lasting significance. Bronze Age inhabitants established the settlement on a narrow ridge protected by steep valleys on 3 sides. Springs provided reliable water, while the elevated position offered commanding views of approaching travelers or armies. This combination of defensibility and accessibility made the site attractive to successive generations of inhabitants. The spiritual landscape proved as complex as the political geography. Canaanite religion centered on fertility deities who controlled the agricultural cycles upon which survival depended. Baal commanded the storms that brought life-giving rain to parched fields. Asherah represented the nurturing earth that received seeds and produced harvests. Astarte governed human fertility and the continuation of family lines. High places on hilltops hosted open-air sanctuaries where priests performed rituals designed to ensure cosmic harmony and agricultural abundance. These religious practices reflected the deep integration between human communities and natural cycles. Seasonal festivals marked planting and harvest times. Sacred prostitution symbolically enacted the divine marriage between sky and earth. Child sacrifice, though apparently rare, represented the ultimate offering to deities whose favor meant survival or starvation for entire communities. As the second millennium BC dawned, Egyptian power expanded northward into Canaan. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom transformed Egypt into a military empire, extending their control from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates in the north. Canaan became a crucial component of this imperial system, providing tribute, strategic bases, and buffer protection against Mesopotamian rivals. The Tel El Amarna correspondence reveals the complex reality of Egyptian rule in Canaan during the 14th century BC. These clay tablets, written in Akkadian diplomatic language, preserve frantic appeals from Canaanite rulers pleading for Egyptian military assistance against rivals and rebels. Abdi-Heber of Jerusalem repeatedly warned Pharaoh Akhenaten that enemies threatened to seize the city. Let the king provide garrison troops, lest the entire land of the king be lost. Lebayu of Shechem engaged in chronic warfare with neighboring city-states, prompting multiple complaints to the Egyptian court. His activities disrupted the tribute system and threatened Egyptian commercial interests throughout central Canaan. When Lebayu was finally killed, his sons continued the rebellion, demonstrating the persistent tensions beneath Egyptian imperial control. The Amarna letters expose a world of shifting alliances, territorial disputes, and personal ambitions among Canaanite city-state rulers. Each controlled limited territory around their fortified centers, competing for resources, trade routes, and Egyptian favor. Rivalries flared between Jerusalem and Gaza, between Gaza and Ashkelon, between Hazor and Damascus. Egyptian governors attempted to maintain order, but distance and limited military presence meant local strongmen often acted independently. One intriguing reference in these diplomatic archives mentions a people called the Habiru, rootless groups who served as mercenaries, raiders, or laborers throughout the region. Some scholars connect this term to the later Hebrew identity, though the relationship remains debated. The Habiru represented social outsiders who existed beyond the normal city-state structure, living by their wits and military skills in a world dominated by urban elites. Egyptian artistic depictions show Canaanite cities with their distinctive architectural features, massive gates, towering walls, multi-story buildings crowded within defensive perimeters. Tribute lists record the wealth flowing from Canaan to Egyptian treasuries: silver, gold, cedar wood, olive oil, wine, textiles, and exotic animals. This economic extraction supported Egyptian imperial ambitions while creating resentment among Canaanite populations bearing the tax burden. The Merneptah stele, erected around 1208 BC, provides the first historical mention of Israel in any ancient source. Pharaoh Merneptah boasted of military victories throughout Canaan, concluding with the famous line, "Israel is wasted, his seed is not." The determinative sign used suggests Israel existed as a people rather than a territorial state, indicating some form of tribal confederation had emerged in the Central Highlands by this date. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age world system collapsed with stunning rapidity. The Hittite Empire vanished almost overnight. Its capital, Hattusa, burned and abandoned. Egyptian power contracted, leaving garrisons and influence networks throughout Canaan without support. Trade networks that had connected the eastern Mediterranean for centuries disintegrated. Urban centers were destroyed or abandoned across the region. The causes of this widespread disruption remain debated among historians. Climate change may have triggered crop failures and famine, forcing populations to migrate in search of resources. Internal rebellions weakened imperial structures. Most dramatically, the mysterious Sea Peoples launched devastating attacks along the Mediterranean coast, destroying cities from Anatolia to Egypt. Egyptian records describe these Sea Peoples as a confederation of displaced populations arriving by land and sea. Their names, Peliset, Jeka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, hint at origins throughout the Mediterranean world. They fought with iron weapons, sailed in distinctive ships with bird-headed prows, and brought families suggesting permanent migration rather than temporary raiding. The Peliset, whom history knows as the Philistines, established themselves along Canaan's southern coast after their defeat by Pharaoh Rameses III around 1175 BC. 5 cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, became centers of Philistine power, each ruled by a lord or seren. These settlements introduced new architectural styles, pottery traditions, and military technologies to Canaan. Most significantly, the Philistines brought iron metallurgy to the region. While bronze required tin that had to be imported from distant sources, iron ore existed locally and could be worked by skilled smiths. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age technology revolutionized agriculture with stronger plows and sickles, while iron weapons provided military advantages over bronze-equipped opponents. Philistine material culture blended influences from their Aegean origins with local Canaanite traditions. Their distinctive pottery showed connections to Mycenaean Greece, while their urban planning reflected Mediterranean patterns. Religious practices included worship of Dagon, a grain deity, alongside traditional Canaanite gods like Baal and Asherah. The Philistine arrival fundamentally altered Canaan's demographic and political landscape. Their military prowess and technological advantages allowed them to dominate the coastal plains and challenge inland populations. The biblical tradition's consistent portrayal of Philistines as Israel's primary enemy reflects historical reality. These newcomers posed an existential threat to highland communities, attempting to establish territorial control. As Bronze Age cities crumbled and imperial systems collapsed, new populations began settling in the previously sparsely inhabited Central Highlands of Canaan. Archaeological surveys reveal a dramatic increase in small settlements throughout the hill country during the early Iron Age. These villages shared distinctive characteristics that marked them as culturally distinct from both Canaanite cities and Philistine settlements. The 4-room house became the standard architectural form in highland villages. These rectangular structures divided interior space into 3 parallel rooms, with a 4th running perpendicular across the back, creating efficient family living areas with space for animals and storage. This practical design reflected a mixed agricultural economy, combining crop cultivation with animal husbandry. Collar-rim jars provided another diagnostic marker of highland culture. These large storage vessels, with their distinctive ridged rims, served multiple functions in village life, storing grain, oil, and water while facilitating transport and trade. Their ubiquity across highland sites suggests shared cultural traditions and economic practices among scattered communities. Perhaps most significantly, these highland settlements lacked pig bones in their refuse deposits. While Canaanite and Philistine sites regularly yield pig remains, indicating pork consumption, the highland villages show a clear avoidance of swine. This dietary practice would later become a defining characteristic of Jewish identity, suggesting cultural continuities spanning centuries. The settlement pattern reflected adaptation to highland environments. Villages clustered around water sources, springs, wells, or cisterns carved into bedrock. Terraced slopes maximized agricultural land while preventing erosion on steep hillsides. Olive trees and grapevines thrived in Mediterranean climate conditions, while grain cultivation occupied valley floors and gentler slopes. Population growth in the highlands accelerated throughout the 12th and 11th centuries BC. What began as scattered farmsteads evolved into substantial villages housing hundreds of inhabitants. Some communities constructed defensive walls or watchtowers, suggesting increasing organization and external threats. The demographic shift represented one of ancient Canaan's most significant transformations. The hill country settlers developed decentralized social and political structures appropriate to their scattered settlements and mixed economy. Extended families formed the basic social unit, with several families constituting village populations. Tribal affiliations provided broader identity and mutual support networks, though territorial boundaries remained fluid and overlapping. The period between the collapse of Egyptian imperial control and the emergence of Israelite monarchy witnessed the development of a unique form of governance in the Central Hills. Leadership remained largely decentralized, with authority resting in family heads, village elders, and occasional charismatic figures who emerged during crises. This system, preserved in biblical tradition as the era of judges, reflected both the hill country settlements' social structure and their external pressures. The Book of Judges preserves memories of this turbulent era through a series of hero stories following a consistent pattern. Apostasy from proper religious practices led to oppression by enemies, prompting desperate prayers for deliverance. In response, charismatic leaders emerged to rally resistance and achieve temporary victories. Peace followed until the cycle repeated with new crises and new deliverers. Deborah's victory over local forces at Mount Tabor demonstrates the hill settlement's capacity for armed cooperation when facing existential threats. The Song of Deborah, one of Hebrew literature's oldest texts, celebrates tribal unity against Sisera's chariot forces. Archaeological evidence from Hazor shows massive destruction around this period, possibly connected to conflicts described in biblical tradition. Gideon's campaigns against Midianite raiders reflect the ongoing pressure from nomadic groups exploiting the power vacuum left by imperial collapse. Such camel-riding warriors could strike quickly across long distances, devastating agricultural settlements before hill defenders could respond effectively. Gideon's night attack, using unconventional tactics, torches, trumpets, and psychological warfare, illustrates the improvised nature of hill country resistance. Samson's exploits in coastal territory highlight the chronic border warfare between hill settlements and coastal city-states. His superhuman strength becomes a metaphor for Israel's potential power when properly focused, though his eventual capture and death symbolize the costs of internal division and external pressure. Archaeological destruction layers at coastal sites during this period suggest sustained conflict along the hill coastal frontier. The judge system's effectiveness depended on voluntary cooperation among independent settlements. No central authority could compel tribal participation in armed campaigns or legal proceedings. Success required persuasive leadership, shared threats, and common cultural values. Such decentralized approaches provided flexibility and resilience, but limited the scale and duration of coordinated action. Religious practices during this period reflected the complex cultural mixing occurring throughout the land. Hill settlements maintained devotion to their ancestral deity, known by various names, including El and Yahweh. However, they also participated in local religious festivals and visited shrines dedicated to Baal and Asherah. Such religious syncretism would become a persistent source of tension in later biblical narratives. Warfare remained endemic throughout the Judge period. Coastal forces and their iron technology posed constant threats to hill expansion. Urban city-states controlled strategic valleys and trade routes. Nomadic groups conducted seasonal raids on agricultural settlements. Conflicts between hill tribes over territory and resources further complicated the security situation. The tribal confederation's limitations became increasingly apparent as external pressures intensified. Coastal expansion into hill territory threatened to fragment the scattered settlements. Internal disputes weakened collective resistance. The lack of permanent armed leadership meant each crisis required new mobilization efforts. Young warriors began advocating for more centralized authority capable of sustained resistance. Hill villages during the Judge period developed a distinctive material culture adapted to their mountainous environment and mixed agricultural economy. Houses clustered around central courtyards where families gathered for meals, craft production, and social activities. Storage rooms contained large jars filled with olive oil, wine, and grain, the agricultural surplus that supported village life through winter months and lean years. Women ground grain using stone querns, baked bread in dome-shaped ovens, and wove textiles on vertical looms. They managed household production, while men worked fields, tended flocks, and handled external trade relationships. Children learned adult roles through participation in daily activities, with boys following fathers to fields and workshops, while girls assisted mothers in domestic tasks. Iron tools revolutionized agricultural productivity during this period. Stronger plowshares could break highland soils more effectively than bronze implements. Iron axes cleared forested slopes for cultivation. Improved sickles accelerated harvest work. The technological advantage initially held by Philistine smiths gradually spread to highland communities through trade, capture, and imitation. Pottery production reflected both practical needs and cultural preferences. Highland potters created functional vessels, cooking pots, storage jars, oil lamps, and serving bowls. Using local clay sources, decorative elements remained minimal compared to elaborate Canaanite and Philistine styles, suggesting cultural values, emphasizing utility over display. Trade networks connected highland villages to broader Mediterranean commerce despite their seemingly isolated locations. Excavations reveal imported goods, copper from Cyprus, jewelry from Mesopotamia, decorative shells from the Red Sea. These luxury items indicate social differentiation within highland communities and participation in regional exchange systems. Religious artifacts from highland sites show the complex spiritual landscape of this period. Stone altars, libation vessels, and figurines demonstrate continued participation in Canaanite religious traditions. However, the absence of certain elements, particularly elaborate temple complexes and divine images, suggests evolving religious practices that would later distinguish Israelite worship. Warfare's impact appears throughout highland material culture. Weapons become more common in archaeological deposits. Fortification walls surround larger settlements. Storage facilities shift to hidden locations, less vulnerable to raiding. These adaptations reflect the militarized environment that characterized the Judge period. No external threat shaped highland development more decisively than Philistine expansion inland from coastal strongholds. These sea peoples possessed military technologies and organizational capabilities that challenged traditional Canaanite patterns of warfare. Their iron weapons, coordinated infantry tactics, and siege capabilities posed unprecedented challenges to highland communities. Philistine material culture reveals a sophisticated urban civilization, blending Mediterranean traditions with local adaptations. Their distinctive pottery, featuring decorative birds and geometric patterns, showed clear connections to Mycenaean Greek antecedents. Architectural remains indicate planned cities with paved streets, elaborate temples, and residential districts organized by craft specializations. The Philistine monopoly on iron technology created a crucial military advantage during the early Iron Age. Biblical tradition preserves memory of this situation. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, "Lest the Hebrews make swords or spears." Highland communities depended on Philistine smiths for iron tools and weapons, creating technological dependence alongside military vulnerability. Philistine religious practices centered on temples dedicated to Dagon and other deities imported from their Mediterranean origins. Archaeological excavations at Ekron reveal a massive temple complex with industrial installations for olive oil production, suggesting religious institutions controlled economic activities as well as spiritual life. This concentration of power enabled coordinated military campaigns and territorial expansion. The gradual Philistine penetration into highland territory threatened to fragment the scattered Israelite settlements. Control of strategic valleys isolated highland communities from each other and from external support. Philistine garrisons dominated key trade routes, extracting tribute from merchant caravans and local populations. The military pressure created momentum toward political centralization among highland tribes. Border warfare intensified throughout the 11th century BC as Philistine expansion met highland resistance. Fortified sites like Beth Shemesh changed hands repeatedly. Raids and counter-raids devastated agricultural settlements. The conflict's destructive character appears in archaeological destruction layers at numerous sites along the highland coastal frontier. Individual heroes emerged from this crucible of conflict, their exploits preserved in oral traditions that later became biblical narratives. These warrior leaders combined military prowess with spiritual authority, mobilizing highland resistance through personal charisma and divine sanction. Their temporary successes demonstrated the highland community's fighting potential, while highlighting the limitations of decentralized leadership. By the late 11th century BC, pressure for political transformation had reached a critical threshold among highland communities. The Philistine threat continued escalating, while internal divisions weakened collective resistance. Traditional leadership structures proved inadequate for sustained military campaigns and territorial defense. Young warriors advocated for permanent military command capable of coordinating tribal resources. The transition toward monarchy represented both continuity and revolution in highland political development. Kinship remained the fundamental organizing principle, but authority shifted from extended family networks to charismatic individuals claiming divine authorization. Traditional council deliberations gave way to royal command structures. Voluntary tribal cooperation evolved into compulsory state service. Religious transformation accompanied political change as highland communities refined their understanding of divine authority and human kingship. The concept of covenant, binding agreements between the deity and chosen people, provided theological framework for centralized leadership claiming divine sanction. Prophetic figures emerged to validate or challenge royal authority based on adherence to covenant obligations. Military necessity drove much of this political evolution. Coordinated resistance against Philistine expansion required sustained organization beyond the capabilities of traditional tribal structures. Professional warriors needed regular support rather than seasonal mobilization. Fortification construction and maintenance demanded centralized planning and resource allocation. Economic factors reinforced the momentum toward political centralization. Highland agricultural productivity could support larger populations and specialized crafts. Trade relationships required diplomatic representation and commercial regulation. The wealth generated by agricultural surplus and commercial activity provided resources for supporting royal courts and professional armies. The Highland communities stood poised at a historical crossroads as the second millennium BC drew to a close. Behind them lay centuries of gradual adaptation to their mountainous environment, development of distinctive cultural practices, and resistance to external pressures. Ahead lay the revolutionary transformation from tribal confederation to territorial monarchy that would create the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. This transformation would not occur without internal debate and external crisis. The step from decentralized leadership to royal authority represented a fundamental change in political culture that challenged traditional values while promising enhanced security. The tension between innovation and tradition, between collective decision-making and royal command, between tribal loyalty and state authority, would define the coming centuries of Highland political development. The foundations had been laid through centuries of gradual settlement, cultural development, and external pressure. Highland communities possess the demographic base, cultural cohesion, and military capability necessary for state formation. The Philistine challenge provided the external crisis that would catalyze political transformation. All that remained was the emergence of charismatic leadership, capable of uniting the tribes and establishing the institutions of centralized authority. The age of judges was ending. The age of kings was about to begin. The transformation from tribal confederation to centralized monarchy began not with grand proclamations or elaborate ceremonies, but with desperate necessity. Coastal raiders had penetrated deep into the central hills, threatening the very survival of the scattered settlements that had flourished during the Judge period. The old system of occasional charismatic leaders mobilizing temporary coalitions could no longer protect territory or maintain order against sustained external pressure. Samuel, the last great judge and a priest of considerable influence, initially resisted the calls for permanent royal authority. He understood that monarchy would fundamentally alter the relationship between divine authority and human governance that had sustained the tribal confederation. Yet even Samuel recognized the crisis facing his people. The Philistines controlled iron production, possessed superior weapons, and fielded coordinated armies that could overwhelm individual tribal militias. Something had to change, or the hill settlements would face extinction. The choice of Saul as the first king reflected both practical considerations and divine sanction. Standing head and shoulders above his contemporaries, this Benjamite farmer possessed the physical presence that ancient peoples expected in their war leaders. His tribal affiliation proved politically astute. Benjamin occupied strategic territory between the northern and southern tribes, making him acceptable to both regions. Most importantly, his demonstrated courage in rescuing the besieged city of Jabesh Gilead showed his capacity for decisive action under pressure. Saul's early reign brought immediate armed successes that validated the decision to establish royal authority. His victory at Michmash broke coastal control over the central hills and demonstrated that coordinated tribal forces could defeat professional armies when properly led. The psychological impact proved as significant as the tactical achievement. For the first time in generations, the hill peoples had driven foreign invaders from their ancestral territory rather than merely surviving their raids. The new monarch faced the enormous challenge of creating governmental institutions capable of supporting permanent royal authority. Traditional tribal structures remained intact, but Saul superimposed royal administration over existing leadership patterns. He established a royal court, appointed commanders, and began collecting taxes to support professional soldiers. The transformation proved difficult for populations accustomed to voluntary cooperation and consensus decision-making. Religious tensions accompanied these structural changes. Samuel's warnings about royal authority proved prescient as Saul began exercising functions traditionally reserved for priestly leadership. When the king performed sacrificial rituals without priestly authorization, he challenged the careful balance between secular and sacred authority that had characterized the Judge period. Such actions created lasting conflicts between royal prerogatives and religious traditions. Saul's psychological deterioration became evident as external pressures mounted and internal opposition grew. The king, who had once rallied tribal warriors through personal charisma, increasingly relied on coercion and violence to maintain control. His obsessive pursuit of David, originally his most trusted military commander, reflected deeper anxieties about the legitimacy and sustainability of his revolutionary authority structure. The king's final campaign against Philistine forces at Mount Gilboa ended in catastrophic defeat and royal suicide. Saul's death, along with 3 of his sons, including the heir Jonathan, left the nascent monarchy in crisis. The Philistines resumed their expansion into hill territory, seizing control of strategic valleys and threatening to fragment the scattered settlements once again. The experiment in centralized government appeared to have failed completely. Yet the brief reign had established crucial precedents for future development. The tribes had demonstrated their capacity for sustained cooperation under royal leadership. Professional armies had proven capable of defeating superior enemy forces. Administrative structures had shown their potential for coordinating resources across tribal boundaries. Most importantly, the concept of divinely sanctioned monarchy had taken root in popular consciousness, creating expectations that would shape subsequent developments. David's rise to power began in the chaos following Saul's death. This young shepherd from Bethlehem had gained renown as a warrior, musician, and charismatic leader during his service in Saul's court. His victories against coastal champions, particularly the giant Goliath, had made him a folk hero among the tribal populations. When Saul's paranoia forced David into exile, he gathered around himself a band of outcasts, debtors, and malcontents who formed the nucleus of his future army. The period of civil war that followed Saul's death revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the emerging royal system. Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, claimed the throne with backing from Abner, the powerful commander who had served his father. David established himself as king over Judah in the south, ruling from Hebron with support from his own tribal confederation. For 7 years, the 2 rival courts fought intermittent warfare that devastated the central hills, and allowed Sea People's expansion to continue unchecked. David's eventual triumph resulted from superior leadership, strategic alliances, and fortunate circumstances rather than overwhelming force. Abner's defection to David's cause eliminated Ishbosheth's most capable supporter, though the general's subsequent assassination by David's commander Joab nearly derailed the reunification process. When Ishbosheth himself fell victim to assassination, the northern tribes reluctantly accepted David's authority as the only alternative to continued civil war and foreign domination. The new king's first priority involved establishing a capital that could unite the fractured tribal confederation while providing strategic advantages for territorial defense. Jerusalem, held by the Jebusite population since Bronze Age times, offered the perfect solution. Its location on the boundary between northern and southern tribal territories made it politically neutral. The hilltop position provided natural defensive advantages, while springs ensured reliable water supplies. Most importantly, capturing this fortified city would demonstrate royal power while avoiding favoritism toward any particular tribal group. David's conquest of Jerusalem through infiltration of its water systems became legendary among his followers. The capture proved that professional forces could overcome supposedly impregnable fortifications when led by capable commanders using innovative tactics. The king immediately declared the city his personal possession, establishing it as the administrative center of his expanding realm and avoiding traditional tribal territorial claims. The establishment of Jerusalem as royal capital marked a fundamental shift in the political geography of the hill country. For the first time since the Bronze Age collapse, a single center controlled territory from Dan to Beersheba. David's administration could coordinate military campaigns, collect taxes, regulate trade, and administer justice across tribal boundaries. The scattered settlements that had struggled for survival during the Judge period now formed part of a unified territorial state. Religious centralization accompanied political unification as David transported the sacred Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. This ancient symbol of divine presence among the tribal confederation now resided in the royal capital, linking religious authority with monarchical power. The king's public dancing before the Ark demonstrated his personal devotion while asserting royal prerogatives in religious matters. Traditional priestly families found themselves incorporated into royal administration, though not without tensions over proper spheres of authority. David's military campaigns extended royal control far beyond the original tribal territories. Philistine power was broken through a series of decisive victories that eliminated their threat to hill settlement. Moabite, Edomite, and Ammonite territories fell under tributary relationships with the expanding state. Most dramatically, David's forces reached Damascus, creating an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the Egyptian border, the largest territorial extent ever achieved by rulers from this region. The administrative structures developed during David's reign provided the foundation for sustained imperial governance. Professional armies replaced tribal militias, enabling coordinated campaigns across multiple theaters. Royal appointments superseded traditional kinship leadership in many regions. Scribal schools trained bureaucrats capable of maintaining records, collecting taxes, and enforcing royal decisions. Foreign advisors and mercenary forces supplemented local personnel, bringing external expertise to governmental operations. Economic transformation accompanied territorial expansion as tribute, trade, and taxation generated unprecedented wealth. The modest agricultural surplus that had supported village life during the Judge period now funded royal courts, professional armies, monumental construction projects, and international diplomacy. Jerusalem grew from a small hilltop fortress into a substantial urban center, housing thousands of residents engaged in governmental, military, and commercial activities. David's court attracted talent from throughout the ancient Near East, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the parochial character of tribal society. Foreign wives cemented diplomatic relationships while introducing new cultural influences. International merchants established trading networks that connected the hill country with Mediterranean and Mesopotamian commerce. Skilled craftsmen, architects, and artists found patronage for projects that celebrated royal power and divine favor. The king's personal charisma and military prowess maintained unity among diverse populations that had little previous experience with centralized authority. David's reputation as both warrior and poet, his accessibility to common people, and his genuine religious devotion created loyalty that transcended traditional tribal affiliations. His ability to inspire fierce personal attachment among his followers provided the social cement necessary for holding together his revolutionary political creation. Yet beneath the surface success, tensions accumulated that would challenge future rulers. Traditional tribal leaders resented their reduced status within royal administration. Religious authorities worried about the concentration of sacred and secular power in royal hands. Regional populations chafed under taxation and military service obligations that benefited distant imperial projects. The rapid pace of social change created dislocations that affected every aspect of daily life. David's family troubles reflected broader challenges facing the new monarchical system. His multiple wives and concubines, acquired through political necessity and personal desire, created competing claims for succession that threatened governmental stability. The rebellion led by his son Absalom revealed the depth of opposition to royal authority among traditional elites who felt marginalized by centralized administration. Only David's personal loyalty among key military commanders and foreign mercenaries prevented the collapse of his revolutionary creation. The king's final years were marked by administrative consolidation and preparation for peaceful succession. Solomon, the son of Bathsheba, emerged as the designated heir, despite not being the eldest royal son. His selection reflected David's judgment about leadership capabilities rather than traditional inheritance patterns. Another break with customary practices that royal authority made possible. The transition proceeded smoothly, demonstrating that monarchical institutions had achieved sufficient stability to survive their founder's death. Solomon inherited a unified territorial state with established administrative structures, professional military forces, and international recognition. The young king possessed intellectual gifts and cultural sophistication that complemented his father's military genius and charismatic leadership. Where David had been a warrior poet who created an empire through personal prowess, Solomon would become an administrator builder who consolidated royal authority through institutional development and monumental construction. The new ruler's first priority involved strengthening governmental institutions capable of managing the complex territorial state he had inherited. Solomon expanded the bureaucratic apparatus, creating specialized departments for different governmental functions. Royal governors replaced traditional tribal leaders in many regions, ensuring direct royal control over provincial administration. The military was reorganized into professional units supported by chariot forces and fortified cities strategically positioned throughout the realm. Economic development received unprecedented attention as Solomon exploited the commercial opportunities created by his father's conquests. The kingdom's strategic position between Egypt and Mesopotamia made it a natural entrepot for international trade. Royal trading expeditions reached Ophir, possibly in East Africa or South Arabia, bringing back gold, precious stones, and exotic goods. Partnerships with Phoenician merchants expanded maritime commerce, while overland caravans carried luxury items across the developing trade networks. Solomon's building projects transformed Jerusalem from David's modest capital into one of the ancient world's most magnificent cities. The royal palace complex, requiring 13 years to complete, demonstrated unprecedented architectural ambition and artistic sophistication. Foreign craftsmen and materials created structures that rivaled the great capitals of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The city's expansion accommodated growing populations of governmental officials, merchants, craftsmen, and service providers, attracted by royal patronage and commercial opportunities. The Temple of the Lord, Solomon's most famous construction project, represented the culmination of religious centralization begun during David's reign. This magnificent structure, built with cedar from Lebanon and adorned with gold and precious stones, provided a permanent dwelling place for the divine presence that had previously resided in portable shrines. The temple's dedication ceremony, featuring elaborate sacrifices and musical performances, demonstrated royal authority over religious as well as secular affairs. International diplomacy flourished during Solomon's reign, as foreign rulers sought relationships with the prosperous and powerful kingdom. The famous visit of the Queen of Sheba highlighted the royal court's reputation for wisdom and wealth throughout the ancient world. Marriage alliances with Egyptian, Moabite, and other royal families cemented political relationships while introducing foreign cultural influences into Jerusalem's cosmopolitan society. The king's legendary wisdom attracted scholars, merchants, and diplomats from throughout the ancient Near East. Solomon's judicial decisions, administrative innovations, and intellectual achievements created a reputation that enhanced the kingdom's international prestige. The royal court became a center of learning, where traditional tribal wisdom merged with sophisticated international knowledge to create new forms of literature, music, and religious thought. Administrative efficiency reached new heights as Solomon's government managed increasingly complex territorial and economic responsibilities. The kingdom was divided into 12 administrative districts, each responsible for supporting the royal court for 1 month annually. This system distributed the tax burden while ensuring regular revenue flows to fund governmental operations. Professional administrators, trained in scribal schools, maintained detailed records of income, expenditures, and resource allocation. Military technology advanced significantly during Solomon's reign as iron weapons became standard equipment for royal forces. Chariot units, modeled on Egyptian and Mesopotamian examples, provided mobile striking power for major campaigns. Fortified cities at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gaza protected strategic approaches to the heartland, while serving as bases for provincial administration. The professional army, supplemented by foreign mercenaries, could maintain order throughout the expanded territories while deterring external threats. Cultural achievements during this period established lasting foundations for intellectual and artistic development. The royal court patronized literature, music, and religious thought that would influence subsequent generations. Scribal schools preserved traditional stories, while creating new works celebrating royal achievements and divine favor. The merger of tribal traditions with international influences produced distinctive cultural forms that reflected the kingdom's unique position in the ancient world. Yet the unprecedented prosperity and power came at enormous cost to the general population. Solomon's building projects required massive labor mobilization that disrupted agricultural production and family life. The royal court's luxury consumption strained economic resources, forcing higher taxation and more extensive forced labor obligations. Foreign wives introduced religious practices that challenged traditional exclusive devotion to the ancestral deity, creating tensions between royal policy and popular sentiment. Regional resentment grew as provincial populations bore increasing burdens to support royal projects that provided few direct benefits to their daily lives. The traditional tribal autonomy that had characterized Highland society for centuries gave way to centralized control that many viewed as oppressive foreign domination. Northern tribes, in particular, felt exploited by southern rulers, who showed greater concern for international prestige than regional welfare. Religious opposition emerged as traditional religious leaders, and devout populations questioned the theological implications of Solomon's policies. The construction of shrines for foreign deities to accommodate royal wives contradicted the exclusive devotion to Yahweh that had distinguished tribal religion from surrounding cultures. Prophetic voices began warning that divine favor depended on maintaining covenantal obligations rather than achieving political success and material prosperity. Economic problems accumulated despite the kingdom's apparent wealth and international recognition. The costs of maintaining royal luxury, supporting professional military forces, and funding monumental construction exceeded even the substantial revenues generated by trade and taxation. Solomon found himself forced to cede territory to foreign creditors and impose increasingly heavy burdens on domestic populations to meet fiscal obligations. Social tensions reflected the broader transformation of Highland society, from tribal confederation to territorial monarchy. Traditional egalitarian values conflicted with the hierarchical relationships necessary for imperial administration. Kinship-based social organization competed with bureaucratic structures that emphasized technical competence over genealogical connections. The rapid pace of change created dislocations that affected every aspect of community life. The kingdom that Solomon bequeathed to his successors represented both the culmination of monarchical achievement and the seeds of future division. Territorial unity, administrative sophistication, military power, and international recognition demonstrated the potential of centralized royal authority. Yet regional resentments, religious tensions, economic pressures, and social dislocations created vulnerabilities that threatened the entire imperial structure. When Solomon died around 930 BC, the question facing his successors was whether royal institutions had become sufficiently established to maintain unity among increasingly diverse and dissatisfied populations. The 40-year reign had transformed a collection of hill settlements into a major regional power. But this revolutionary achievement had come at costs that many inhabitants found increasingly difficult to bear. The stage was set for the constitutional crisis that would determine whether David's political creation could survive its third generation or would fragment under the pressures that centralized authority had generated. Solomon's death around 930 BC precipitated the constitutional crisis that his policies had made inevitable. The aging king left behind a realm stretched to its breaking point, magnificent in its architectural achievements and international reputation, yet burdened by crushing taxation, forced labor obligations, and regional resentments that had festered throughout his 4-decade reign. The question now facing the tribal confederation was whether royal institutions possessed sufficient legitimacy to survive their third generation, or would fragment under accumulated pressures. Rehoboam, Solomon's chosen successor, inherited both the throne and the impossible task of maintaining unity among increasingly alienated populations. The new ruler possessed neither his grandfather David's charismatic leadership nor his father's administrative genius. More problematically, he appeared to lack any understanding of the delicate balance between royal authority and popular consent that had sustained the monarchical experiment through its foundational decades. The crisis erupted immediately during Rehoboam's coronation assembly at Shechem, the ancient gathering place where tribal representatives had traditionally met to discuss matters of common concern. Northern leaders arrived with specific demands for relief from the oppressive fiscal burdens that Solomon's building projects and court luxury had imposed. Their spokesman, Jeroboam, had fled to Egypt during Solomon's reign after leading earlier protests against royal labor policies. Jeroboam's return from Egyptian exile brought together the accumulated grievances of a generation that had sacrificed enormously for imperial glory while receiving few tangible benefits. The northern tribes had provided the bulk of the forced labor for Jerusalem's construction projects. Their agricultural surplus had funded royal expeditions to distant lands. Their young men had died in campaigns that extended royal control over territories they would never see. Now they demanded fundamental changes in governmental structure and fiscal policy. The fateful exchange at Shechem revealed the gulf separating royal perspectives from popular expectations. When tribal representatives requested that Rehoboam lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, they appealed to traditional concepts of reciprocal obligation between rulers and ruled. The king's harsh response, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke," rejected any limitation on royal prerogatives and demonstrated stunning political miscalculation. Rehoboam's advisors had split along generational lines that reflected deeper disagreements about the nature of royal authority. Elder counselors who had witnessed the transformation from tribal confederation to territorial state urged moderation and compromise to preserve unity. Younger courtiers, raised in Solomon's cosmopolitan environment, advocated assertions of absolute power based on foreign models of divine kingship. The king's choice to follow younger advice proved catastrophic. The northern tribes' rebellion began with ritual rejection of Davidic authority. What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse, echoed through the assembly as representatives formally severed their allegiance to the southern dynasty. When Rehoboam dispatched Adoram, his minister of forced labor, to restore order, the official's stoning death demonstrated the depth of popular fury and the completeness of the political rupture. Jeroboam's proclamation as king over the northern tribes created two competing centers of royal authority where previously one had existed. The former unified realm split along roughly tribal lines, with the Northern Confederation controlling the bulk of the territory and population that had comprised Solomon's state. Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, forming a rump state centered on Jerusalem, but reduced to a fraction of its former extent. The partition reflected not merely political disagreements, but fundamental cultural and economic differences that royal unification had temporarily obscured. The northern territories possessed greater agricultural productivity, more extensive trade networks, and stronger connections to international commerce. Their populations had experienced more intensive cultural mixing with foreign influences and maintained less exclusive devotion to Jerusalem's religious institutions. Judah's southern highlands, by contrast, remained more traditionally oriented and geographically isolated. The difficult terrain that had protected tribal independence during the Judge period now limited economic development and foreign contact. Jerusalem's role as religious center provided cultural cohesion, but the restricted territory could barely support the governmental apparatus inherited from the unified monarchy. Jeroboam faced the enormous challenge of creating legitimate royal institutions for a rebel confederation that had rejected established authority. Unlike Saul and David, who had built their kingdoms gradually through military success and charismatic leadership. The northern king needed to establish governmental structures immediately for populations accustomed to centralized administration. The new ruler possessed neither the resources nor the time for gradual institutional development. The northern capital presented the first major challenge. Jerusalem's capture by David had provided the unified monarchy with a neutral center that belonged to no particular tribe. Jeroboam initially established his court at Shechem, honoring the site of his proclamation, but the city's location left it vulnerable to southern attack. He later moved to Tirzah, a more defensible position that could serve as a permanent administrative center. Religious innovation became central to Jeroboam's strategy for establishing northern independence from Jerusalem's religious monopoly. The king constructed golden calves at Dan and Bethel, declaring, "Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." The calves likely served as divine thrones, rather than idols themselves, following ancient Near Eastern traditions, where deities stood upon animal pedestals. This theological distinction mattered less than the shrine's function as alternatives to Jerusalem's temple. The placement of rival sanctuaries at the northern and southern borders of Jeroboam's realm reflected sophisticated understanding of religious geography. Dan's location near the headwaters of the Jordan controlled access from Phoenician and Aramean territories. Bethel's position along the central ridge route intercepted pilgrims traveling toward Jerusalem from northern regions. Both sites possessed ancient religious associations that predated the unified monarchy, lending legitimacy to their restoration as major cultic centers. Jeroboam's religious innovations extended beyond shrine construction to encompass fundamental changes in liturgical calendar and priestly personnel. The northern king shifted the harvest festival from the 7th to the 8th month, preventing his subjects from participating in Jerusalem's autumn celebrations. He appointed priests from tribes other than Levi, breaking the traditional monopoly of Jerusalem's religious establishment. Such changes created distinctively northern religious practices that supported political independence. The economic foundations of the divided realms reflected their different geographical advantages and resource bases. Northern Israel controlled the fertile Jezreel Valley and the coastal approaches that provided access to Mediterranean trade networks. The realm's agricultural productivity supported larger populations and generated surplus for international commerce. Phoenician partnerships, particularly with Tyre, brought technological expertise and commercial opportunities that enhanced northern prosperity. Judah's more restricted territory limited economic development, but provided certain strategic advantages. The southern realm controlled Jerusalem's established administrative apparatus and international recognition as the successor to Solomon's empire. The capital's accumulated wealth, though depleted by the partition, still exceeded resources available to the northern upstart. Most importantly, Judah retained the temple and its associated religious revenues from pilgrims and offerings. Border warfare erupted almost immediately as both realms attempted to expand their territorial control and deny resources to their rival. The boundary between Israel and Judah remained fluid for generations, with fortified cities changing hands repeatedly as fortunes shifted. Ramah, Bethel, and other strategic positions were fortified, abandoned, and refortified as each side sought tactical advantages in the ongoing conflict. Rehoboam's attempt to reconquer the north through force ended in failure when the prophet Shemaiah declared divine opposition to fratricidal warfare. The southern king assembled substantial forces for invasion, but disbanded them in the face of prophetic condemnation. This religious intervention established an important precedent. Prophetic voices could limit royal authority when divine will contradicted monarchical ambitions. Foreign intervention complicated the rivalry between the sister states and demonstrated their reduced international status compared to the unified monarchy. Pharaoh Shishak invaded both territories around 925 BC, seizing Jerusalem's temple treasures and devastating numerous cities throughout the region. Records at Karnak document the destruction of over 150 settlements, revealing the extent of foreign exploitation of Hebrew weakness. The Egyptian campaign highlighted how partition had transformed the region from a significant regional power into competing petty kingdoms, vulnerable to external manipulation. Where Solomon had dealt with foreign rulers as an equal, his successors found themselves dependent on outside support and subject to foreign intervention. The magnificent empire that David had created through conquest had fragmented into client states struggling for survival. Religious developments in both kingdoms reflected the tensions between traditional practices and royal innovations. Northern Israel's alternative shrines attracted worshippers who found Jeroboam's reforms more accessible than Jerusalem's elaborate temple rituals. However, the golden calves also facilitated syncretistic practices that blended Yahwistic worship with traditional fertility religions. Prophetic voices increasingly condemned such religious mixing as apostasy from covenant obligations. Judah's maintenance of Jerusalem's temple provided religious continuity, but created its own challenges. The reduced kingdom could barely support the elaborate liturgical establishment that Solomon had created for his empire. Temple personnel found their revenues diminished while their responsibilities remained unchanged. The contrast between past glory and present poverty created dissatisfaction among religious professionals who had prospered during the unified monarchy. The Omride dynasty's rise to power in northern Israel around 885 BC marked a new phase in the divided kingdom's development. Omri's military prowess and political acumen ended the chaotic succession disputes that had weakened the northern realm since Jeroboam's death. The new ruler established Samaria as his capital, creating a magnificent urban center that rivaled Jerusalem's architectural achievements and international recognition. Samaria's construction demonstrated northern Israel's economic recovery and political sophistication under Omride leadership. The hilltop site provided natural defensive advantages while offering commanding views of the surrounding countryside. Royal palaces decorated with ivory carvings and administrative buildings housed a bureaucracy capable of governing the expanding northern territories. International merchants established commercial networks that connected Samaria with Mediterranean and Mesopotamian trade routes. Ahab's reign represented the pinnacle of northern power and prosperity during the divided monarchy period. This capable ruler expanded Israel's territory through successful campaigns against Aramean forces, while maintaining profitable relationships with Phoenician trading partners. His marriage to Jezebel, daughter of the Sidonian king, cemented the northern kingdom's integration into international diplomatic networks, while introducing foreign cultural influences that would prove controversial. The Jezebel controversy revealed deep tensions within northern society between cosmopolitan royal policies and traditional religious commitments. The Phoenician queen's promotion of Baal worship challenged the exclusive devotion to Yahweh that many Israelites considered fundamental to their covenantal identity. Her persecution of Yahwistic prophets created martyrs whose deaths became rallying points for religious opposition to royal policies. Elijah's confrontation with Ahab and Jezebel at Mount Carmel became legendary as a defining moment in the struggle between traditional religion and foreign innovation. The prophet's dramatic victory over Baal's priests demonstrated divine power while exposing the impotence of imported deities. More importantly, the episode established prophetic authority as a check on royal prerogatives, creating institutional opposition to policies that contradicted religious traditions. Archaeological discoveries at Samaria reveal the material culture of the northern elite during this prosperous period. Ostraka recorded administrative transactions involving oil and wine shipments from royal estates. Ivory fragments show artistic sophistication that rivaled productions from major international centers. The remains of substantial buildings demonstrate architectural ambitions that reflected the kingdom's recovered confidence and expanding resources. The Mesha Stele provides external confirmation of northern Israel's military capabilities during the Omride period. This Moabite inscription describes King Mesha's successful rebellion against Israelite overlordship, revealing the extent of northern territorial control east of the Jordan River. The monument's detailed account of border warfare, tribute payments, and religious motivations illuminates the complex relationships between the Hebrew kingdoms and their smaller neighbors. Southern Judah's development followed different patterns that reflected its more restricted resources and conservative religious orientation. The Davidic dynasty maintained unbroken succession through this period, providing governmental stability that contrasted with northern Israel's frequent dynastic changes. However, political continuity could not compensate for the southern kingdom's limited territory and reduced international significance. Asa's long reign in Judah demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations facing the southern kingdom during this period. His military victory over Ethiopian forces showed that determined leadership could achieve significant successes despite resource constraints. His religious reforms, removing foreign altars and deposing his grandmother Maacah for promoting Asherah worship, appealed to traditional constituencies while eliminating practices that prophetic voices condemned. The alliance between Asa and Ben-Hadad of Damascus against northern Israel illustrated the complex diplomatic maneuvering that characterized relationships among the small kingdoms of the region. Judah's payment of temple treasures to purchase Aramean intervention against Israel demonstrated both desperation and pragmatic calculation. The southern kingdom could not match northern military strength, but could exploit regional rivalries to achieve strategic objectives. Jehoshaphat's reign marked a high point in Judah's recovery from the partition's initial disruptions. This capable ruler strengthened the kingdom's administrative apparatus, expanded its territorial control, and achieved recognition as a significant regional power. His marriage alliance with Ahab's family ended the chronic warfare between the sister kingdoms, while creating opportunities for coordinated action against common enemies. The partnership between Jehoshaphat and Ahab in their campaign against Ramoth-Gilead revealed both the potential for Hebrew cooperation and the persistent tensions that divided the kingdoms. Military coordination proved possible when facing external threats, but religious and cultural differences continued to complicate relationships between the royal houses. Ahab's death in this joint campaign ended hopes for sustained alliance while demonstrating the costs of regional warfare. Religious developments during this period reflected the ongoing tension between exclusive devotion to Yahweh and the syncretistic practices that royal policies sometimes encouraged. Northern Israel's golden calf shrines facilitated worship practices that traditional voices increasingly condemned as apostasy. Phoenician influences introduced through royal marriages brought foreign religious elements that challenged covenant theology. Prophetic opposition crystallized around demands for religious purity and social justice. Judah's maintenance of Jerusalem's temple provided institutional continuity for traditional religious practices, but popular religion often incorporated elements from surrounding cultures. Archaeological evidence reveals widespread use of figurines associated with fertility worship, suggesting that official temple religion coexisted with household practices that drew from broader regional traditions. The tension between official and popular religion would continue to challenge royal religious policies. Economic specialization emerged as both kingdoms adapted to their reduced circumstances and sought competitive advantages. Northern Israel's agricultural productivity and commercial connections supported larger populations and more sophisticated urban centers. The kingdom's location along major trade routes provided opportunities for taxing international commerce and developing domestic industries that supplied regional markets. Judah's more limited agricultural base forced greater reliance on pastoral activities and specialized craft production. The southern kingdom's control of caravan routes connecting Arabia with Mediterranean markets provided some commercial revenues, but the restricted territory could not support the population densities achieved in the more fertile northern regions. Jerusalem's religious significance attracted pilgrims whose offerings supplemented royal revenues. Border conflicts continued intermittently throughout this period, as both kingdoms sought territorial advantages and denied resources to their rival. Fortified positions along the frontier changed hands repeatedly, with each side constructing defensive works to protect strategic approaches to their heartlands. The warfare remained limited in scope, reflecting the kingdom's inability to achieve decisive victories that might restore territorial unity. The emergence of Aramean Damascus as a major regional power created new challenges for both Hebrew kingdoms. Ben-Hadad's expansion southward threatened Israeli territory, while offering Judah opportunities for alliance against their northern rival. The complex diplomatic relationships that developed among Damascus, Israel, and Judah would dominate regional politics for generations, with each kingdom seeking advantage through shifting alliances and military partnerships. As the 9th century BC progressed, both kingdoms had established stable governmental institutions and achieved recognition as legitimate regional powers. Northern Israel's greater resources and territorial extent made it the more significant international actor, while southern Judah's religious traditions and dynastic continuity provided different forms of legitimacy and influence. The partition that had initially appeared to threaten Hebrew political existence had instead created two viable states that competed for the legacy of David and Solomon's empire. Yet beneath the surface stability, tensions accumulated that would challenge both kingdoms in coming generations. Religious syncretism troubled traditional constituencies who valued covenant exclusivity. Social inequality grew as royal policies favored commercial and administrative elites over agricultural populations. External pressures, mounted as larger empires, expanded their influence throughout the region. The sister kingdoms that had survived their initial separation now faced new tests that would determine their ultimate fate. The shadow of Assyria had long darkened the horizons of the Levantine kingdoms, but during the 8th century BC, this distant threat transformed into immediate catastrophe. From their heartland along the upper Tigris, the Neo-Assyrian Empire unleashed a campaign of conquest that would reshape the ancient Near East and forever alter the trajectory of Hebrew civilization. What began as tribute demands would end with the complete destruction of the northern realm and the disappearance of 10 tribes from the stage of history. Tiglath-Pileser, the third's ascension to the throne in 745 BC, marked the beginning of the empire's most aggressive expansionist phase. This usurper king, who had seized power through palace conspiracy, immediately implemented sweeping reforms that transformed the realm from a traditional territorial state into an efficient imperial machine. Professional armies replaced seasonal levies. Direct provincial administration superseded tributary relationships, and systematic deportation policies prevented rebellious populations from maintaining local identities. The imperial war machine possessed technological and organizational advantages that overwhelmed traditional resistance strategies. Iron weapons equipped professional soldiers who fought in coordinated formations, rather than relying on individual heroics. Siege engines could breach fortifications that had protected cities for centuries. Engineering corps constructed roads, bridges, and supply depots that enabled sustained campaigns across vast distances. Most importantly, sophisticated intelligence networks provided detailed information about enemy capabilities and intentions. The Northern Kingdom first encountered this new threat during the reign of Menahem around 738 BC. When the emperor's forces approached the capital, the king chose submission over resistance, paying enormous tribute to avoid conquest. Imperial records preserve the exact amount, 1,000 talents of silver extracted from wealthy northerners, who each contributed 50 shekels to purchase their realm's survival. This initial payment established the state as a vassal obligated to provide regular tribute and support. The tribute system created unsustainable financial burdens that destabilized northern society and government. Agricultural surpluses that had supported domestic prosperity now flowed to imperial treasuries. Craftsmen and merchants found their profits confiscated to meet demands from the east. The royal court, already strained by competition with the southern realm and regional conflicts, faced impossible choices between popular welfare and imperial obligations. Social tensions escalated as ordinary citizens bore the costs of policies they had no voice in determining. Pekka's accession to the northern throne around 735 BC brought to power a faction determined to break free from eastern vassalage through alliance with neighboring states facing similar pressures. The new king forged a coalition with Rezin of Damascus, hoping that coordinated resistance might succeed where individual defiance had failed. Their strategy required forcing the southern realm to join the anti-imperial alliance, creating a united front across the southern Levant. The Syro-Ephraimite War erupted when Ahaz of the south refused to participate in the rebellion against eastern overlordship. Pekka and Rezin invaded the southern territories with the intention of deposing Ahaz and installing a puppet ruler who would support their coalition. The mountain realm's survival depended on a desperate gamble. Ahaz appealed directly to the emperor for protection, offering to become a vassal in exchange for deliverance from the northern alliance. Isaiah's prophetic intervention during this crisis reflected the religious dimensions of the conflict between imperial submission and national independence. The prophet condemned both the northern coalition's reliance on military force and Judah's appeal to foreign protection, advocating instead for trust in divine deliverance. His famous prediction that a virgin would conceive and bear a son called Emmanuel represented hope for divine intervention when human solutions had failed. The emperor's response to the southern appeal demonstrated imperial strategic sophistication and ruthless efficiency. Rather than simply defending his new vassal, he launched coordinated campaigns that eliminated the anti-imperial coalition while expanding control throughout the region. Damascus fell in 732 BC after a devastating siege that ended Aramean independence forever. Syrian territories were reorganized into imperial provinces under direct administration. The northern realm suffered massive territorial losses as imperial forces systematically conquered its eastern and northern regions. Galilee, with its mixed population and strategic importance, became the province of Megiddo. Transjordanian territories were organized into the province of Gilead. Only the central highlands around the capital remained under nominal local control, reduced to a fraction of the state's former extent and completely surrounded by imperial provinces. The deportation policies implemented in conquered territories established patterns that would later be applied throughout the northern realm. Imperial records document the removal of 13,520 inhabitants from captured regions, representing primarily urban elites, skilled craftsmen, and potential resistance leaders. These deportees were transported to distant parts of the empire, where their specialized skills could serve imperial needs, while their separation from homeland prevented organized rebellion. Hoshea's assassination of Pekah around 730 BC reflected the internal chaos that Assyrian pressure had created within Israelite society. The new king represented pro-Assyrian factions who believed that loyal vassalage offered the only hope for preserving what remained of their truncated kingdom. Tiglath-Pileser formally recognized Hoshea as ruler, though Assyrian records make clear that he governed only with imperial permission and under constant supervision. The reduced Israel that Hoshea inherited bore little resemblance to the prosperous realm that had flourished under the Omride dynasty. Territorial losses had eliminated the kingdom's most productive agricultural regions and important commercial centers. The population remaining under Israelite control consisted largely of hill farmers, whose limited surplus could barely support royal administration, much less satisfy Assyrian tribute demands. Economic collapse accompanied territorial reduction, as trade networks disintegrated and urban centers declined. Shalmaneser V's accession to the Assyrian throne in 727 BC created an opportunity that Hoshea fatally misjudged. The new emperor faced rebellions throughout his realm as subject peoples tested his authority, encouraging the Israelite king to believe that successful resistance might be possible. More tempting still, Egypt's pharaoh, apparently promised military support for anti-Assyrian movements, suggesting that Hoshea might find powerful allies for a liberation struggle. Hoshea's decision to withhold tribute payments and seek Egyptian alliance represented the final gamble of a desperate ruler with few viable options. The king understood that continued vassalage meant slow economic strangulation and eventual absorption into the Assyrian provincial system. Rebellion offered the possibility of restored independence, even though failure would bring complete destruction. The choice reflected not merely personal ambition, but the accumulated frustrations of a population that had sacrificed enormously for imperial peace without achieving security or prosperity. The Egyptian alliance proved worthless when Assyrian retaliation began. Pharaoh either could not or would not provide meaningful support for Israelite resistance, leaving Hoshea to face imperial wrath alone. This abandonment followed patterns established throughout the region. Local rulers repeatedly discovered that distant powers promising assistance failed to deliver when confrontation with Assyria actually materialized. Shalmaneser V's response demonstrated the efficiency and brutality that characterized Assyrian imperial administration. Rather than engaging in prolonged siege warfare, the emperor immediately arrested Hoshea during negotiations, eliminating Israelite leadership at the outset of the rebellion. Assyrian forces then systematically occupied the truncated kingdom's territory, while beginning the siege of Samaria that would determine the northern realm's ultimate fate. The siege of Samaria lasted 3 years, from 725 to 722 BC, representing one of the longest and most devastating military operations in ancient Near Eastern history. The city's hilltop position provided natural defensive advantages that Assyrian siege techniques could not immediately overcome. Substantial food stores allowed the population to survive extended blockade. Most importantly, the defenders understood that surrender meant deportation and cultural extinction, creating determination that sustained resistance despite overwhelming odds. Assyrian siege methods combined technological sophistication with psychological warfare designed to break defender morale. Earthwork ramps enabled siege engines to breach fortification walls. Tunneling operations threatened to undermine defensive positions. Cut supply lines prevented reinforcement or relief. Propaganda campaigns promised mercy for early surrender, while threatening destruction for continued resistance. The systematic approach reflected centuries of imperial experience in reducing fortified positions. Sargon II's completion of the siege, following his predecessor's death, demonstrated Assyrian institutional continuity despite dynastic change. The new emperor inherited not merely a military operation, but a comprehensive imperial policy designed to eliminate Israelite independence permanently. His personal involvement in the siege's final phase emphasized the conquest's significance for Assyrian strategic objectives throughout the region. The fall of Samaria in 722 BC ended the Northern Kingdom's 4-century existence with finality that shocked contemporary observers. Sargon's inscriptions boast of deporting 27,290 inhabitants, though this figure likely represents only the urban population that posed the greatest threat to imperial control. Archaeological evidence confirms massive destruction throughout the city, with burning and deliberate demolition eliminating most substantial buildings. The deportation of Samaria's population followed established Assyrian practices designed to prevent cultural continuity and future rebellion. Deportees were transported to distant regions, including Hala, Habur, Gozan, and various Median territories, where their skills could benefit the empire, while their isolation prevented resistance organization. Simultaneously, foreign populations from Babylon, Kutha, Avva, Hamath, and Sepharvaim were settled in former Israelite territories, creating ethnic mixing that eliminated local identity. The 10 lost tribes disappeared from history through this systematic imperial policy rather than through any single catastrophic event. Deportation scattered the northern tribes across the Assyrian Empire, where they gradually assimilated into local populations and lost their distinctive cultural identity. Unlike the later Judean exile to Babylon, which maintained community structures and religious practices, the Israelite dispersion involved smaller groups integrated into existing societies with different languages and customs. The cultural impact of Israel's destruction extended far beyond the immediate territorial losses and population transfers. The Northern Kingdom had preserved significant portions of ancient Hebrew literature, religious traditions, and historical memories that vanished with the deportations. Archaeological evidence suggests that literacy rates in Israel had been higher than in Judah, indicating substantial intellectual losses when urban elites were removed from their homeland. Judah's survival during this period of regional catastrophe reflected both geographical advantages and skillful diplomacy under King Ahaz. The southern realm's mountainous terrain provided natural defensive barriers that made conquest more difficult than the open territories of northern Israel. More importantly, Ahaz's early submission to Assyrian overlordship had established Judah as a loyal vassal state deserving imperial protection rather than conquest. The refugee crisis created by Israel's destruction profoundly impacted Judean society and culture. Thousands of northern survivors fled southward, seeking safety in Jerusalem and other Judean cities. These refugees brought with them religious traditions, literary works, and historical memories that enriched southern culture, while creating integration challenges for communities unaccustomed to large immigrant populations. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the sudden expansion of Jerusalem's size and population as northern refugees settled in the capital. New residential quarters were constructed outside the old city walls to accommodate the influx. Water systems were expanded to serve larger populations. The demographic transformation temporarily made Jerusalem one of the region's largest urban centers, despite Judah's reduced political significance. The religious impact of the northern destruction challenged traditional theological assumptions about divine protection and covenant relationship. Many survivors questioned how God could permit the complete elimination of 10 tribes while preserving only Judah and Benjamin. Prophetic voices responded by emphasizing human faithfulness and divine justice, arguing that Israel's destruction resulted from covenant violations rather than divine abandonment. Economic consequences of Israel's fall affected trade networks and commercial relationships throughout the southern Levant. The northern kingdom's agricultural productivity and strategic location had made it a crucial link in Mediterranean commerce. Its elimination forced merchants to develop alternative routes while reducing overall regional prosperity. Judah found itself more isolated economically as well as politically, following the loss of its northern neighbor. The Assyrian provincial system, established in former Israelite territories, demonstrated imperial administrative efficiency and long-term planning. The provinces of Megiddo, Gilead, and Samaria were integrated into the broader imperial structure, with appointed governors, regular taxation, and military garrisons. Road networks connected these territories to the imperial heartland, while facilitating rapid troop movements for maintaining order. Cultural syncretism in the former Israelite territories created the mixed population that later sources would call Samaritans. The combination of remaining Hebrew inhabitants with imported foreign populations produced new religious and cultural forms that blended Yahwistic traditions with various international influences. This religious mixing violated traditional Hebrew concepts of covenant exclusivity, while creating communities that maintained some connection to ancient Israelite heritage. Prophetic literature from this period preserved memories of the northern kingdom, while interpreting its destruction as divine judgment for covenant violations. Amos and Hosea, who had prophesied in Israel before its fall, became part of Judean literary collections that emphasized the connection between faithfulness and survival. Their warnings about social injustice and religious syncretism were seen as explaining why God had permitted Assyrian victory. The geopolitical transformation following Israel's destruction left Judah as the sole surviving Hebrew state in a region now dominated by Assyrian imperial administration. This isolation forced fundamental reassessment of religious identity, political strategy, and cultural preservation. The southern kingdom's survival represented both divine mercy and human responsibility to maintain traditions that had been lost in the north. As the 8th century BC concluded, the catastrophic destruction of the northern kingdom had eliminated half of the Hebrew political presence in the ancient Near East. The 10 lost tribes had vanished into Assyrian imperial administration, their distinctive identity dissolved through deportation and resettlement policies. Only Judah remained to carry forward the religious and cultural traditions that had developed during the United Monarchy and survived the partition. The stage was set for the southern kingdom's struggle to maintain independence while preserving the heritage that Israel's destruction had made more precious through its loss. The destruction of the northern realm left the southern kingdom in unprecedented isolation, the sole surviving heir to David's empire and the custodian of Hebrew traditions that had developed over 4 centuries of monarchical rule. Where once 2 rival states had competed for legitimacy and territory, now only the Mountain Kingdom remained to face the enormous challenges of preserving independence while surrounded by eastern provinces and client states that acknowledged foreign overlordship. The king's accession, around 715 BC, brought to the throne a ruler determined to restore both spiritual purity and territorial independence after the compromises that had characterized his father, Ahaz's reign. The new monarch possessed the acumen to understand that successful opposition required careful preparation, popular support, and international alliances that could offset the empire's overwhelming advantages. His reign would test whether a small mountain state could maintain autonomy in an age of expanding eastern control. The spiritual changes that the king implemented represented both genuine conviction and shrewd domestic politics. The monarch ordered the destruction of local shrines and cult objects that his father had permitted, including the bronze serpent that tradition attributed to Moses himself. Sacred poles dedicated to Asherah were cut down throughout the realm. Foreign altars constructed to accommodate diplomatic marriages were demolished. The campaign aimed to centralize worship in the capital, while eliminating practices that prophetic voices condemned as covenant violations. The transformation movement drew its intellectual foundation from scribal circles that had preserved and interpreted ancient Hebrew legal traditions. The discovery of legal texts in the temple archives provided authorization for centralizing worship and eliminating syncretistic practices. These documents, which emphasized exclusive devotion to the ancestral deity and rejection of foreign influences, became the theological basis for challenging Eastern cultural pressures. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the extent of the king's building program, designed to prepare the realm for the coming confrontation with Eastern forces. The capital's walls were strengthened and extended to protect new residential areas that had grown up around the ancient city core. The most impressive achievement was the construction of a tunnel carved through 533 meters of solid rock to bring water from the Gihon spring to a reservoir within the city walls. The tunnel project represented one of ancient engineering's most remarkable achievements, demonstrating both the technical capabilities available to the Mountain Kingdom and the thoroughness of preparations for siege warfare. Work crews began excavation from both ends simultaneously, meeting in the middle with remarkable precision that speaks to sophisticated surveying techniques. The project required months of dangerous underground labor in cramped conditions that tested workers' dedication to the royal cause. The Salome inscription, carved by the tunnel workers to commemorate their achievement, provides a rare glimpse into the human dimension of these massive preparation projects. The text describes the excitement when excavation teams heard each other's pickaxes through the remaining rock wall and the final breakthrough that connected the 2 shafts. Such personal touches remind us that these grand events involved ordinary people whose lives were transformed by royal decisions. Economic policies during this period reflected the challenge of funding preparations, while maintaining popular support in a kingdom whose resources were limited compared to Eastern adversaries. Agricultural productivity was enhanced through terracing projects that expanded cultivatable land in the mountainous terrain. Craft production was encouraged to create exportable goods that could generate revenues for purchasing weapons and hiring mercenaries. Trade relationships with Egypt and other potential allies provided both commercial opportunities and diplomatic channels. The royal administration expanded significantly as the government prepared for the administrative challenges of coordinated opposition. Scribal schools trained bureaucrats capable of managing complex logistical operations. Record-keeping systems tracked resources, personnel, and preparations with unprecedented detail. Provincial governors were appointed to ensure that royal policies were implemented effectively throughout the realm's territory. Foreign policy during this period involved delicate balancing between the competing pressures of Eastern demands and domestic expectations for independence. Egyptian diplomats actively encouraged rebellion against Mesopotamian overlordship, promising support and financial assistance for liberation movements. Babylonian envoys arrived in the capital, representing another potential ally in the growing coalition against Eastern control. Such diplomatic contacts raised hopes for international support, while creating obligations that would prove difficult to fulfill. The revolt of Ashdod in 713 BC provided a test case for the developing anti-Eastern coalition. When the coastal city rebelled, the southern king faced pressure to join the uprising, while recognizing that premature action might bring retaliation before preparations were complete. His decision to remain officially neutral while providing covert support demonstrated sophistication that preserved options for future action while avoiding immediate consequences. Isaiah's prophetic opposition to foreign alliances reflected spiritual concerns about the theological implications of seeking human rather than divine protection. The prophet warned that dependence on Egyptian support violated covenant principles that required exclusive trust in divine deliverance. His symbolic actions, including walking naked and barefoot to represent the fate awaiting those who trusted in foreign alliances, dramatized the spiritual dangers of opposition strategies based on international politics rather than faithful devotion. The growing tension between royal policy and prophetic counsel revealed fundamental disagreements about the relationship between faith and action. The monarch's court included advisors who argued that divine favor required active opposition to Eastern oppression, while prophetic voices warned that human preparations demonstrated lack of trust in divine protection. These theological debates had practical implications for policies that would determine the realm's survival or destruction. Sennacherib's accession to the Eastern throne in 705 BC triggered the widespread rebellions that the southern king had been preparing to join. The new emperor faced simultaneous uprisings in Babylon, the Levant, and other regions where subject peoples tested his authority. The coordination of these revolts suggested extensive diplomatic preparation and mutual support agreements among the various liberation movements. The southern mountain kingdom's entry into open rebellion represented the culmination of years of careful preparation and growing confidence in international support. The monarch expelled Eastern officials, ceased tribute payments, and began operations against neighboring territories that remained loyal to the empire. The capture of Philistine cities demonstrated renewed Hebrew capabilities while securing strategic positions for the coming Eastern response. The siege of Lachish in 701 BC provided a preview of the tactics that Eastern forces would employ against fortified positions throughout the rebellious territories. This major fortress city, second only to the capital in importance within the southern realm, endured a devastating assault that combined technological superiority with psychological warfare designed to break defender morale. Relief sculptures from the palace at Nineveh preserved detailed depictions of the siege techniques that overwhelmed even the strongest defensive positions. Archaeological excavations at Lachish reveal the intensity of the Eastern assault and the destruction that followed the city's capture. Massive siege ramps enabled forces to bring battering rams and siege towers against the fortification walls. Arrowheads found throughout the site indicate intensive archery bombardments. Evidence of burning and deliberate destruction demonstrates the thoroughness of retaliation against rebellious cities. The psychological impact of Lashish's fall reverberated throughout the southern realm, as defenders realized the hopelessness of opposition against Eastern siege techniques. Refugees fleeing the destroyed city brought eyewitness accounts of brutality and technological superiority that shattered illusions about successful liberation. The momentum of rebellion began to shift as other cities calculated the costs of continued defiance. Sennacherib's advance toward the capital represented the climax of the Eastern campaign and the ultimate test of royal preparations. The city's position atop defensible hills provided natural advantages, while the tunnel and water systems ensured adequate supplies for extended siege. However, the surrounding countryside had been devastated. Refugee populations strained resources, and international allies had failed to provide promised support. The famous confrontation between Eastern officials and the capital's defenders, recorded in both Hebrew and Mesopotamian sources, revealed the psychological dimensions of ancient siege warfare. The Rabshakeh's speeches in Hebrew were designed to undermine popular morale by emphasizing the futility of opposition and the unreliability of divine protection. His catalogue of cities that had fallen despite their god's supposed protection challenged the theological foundations of the liberation movement. The sudden withdrawal of Eastern forces from the capital's vicinity became one of the most celebrated events in Hebrew historical memory. Whether the result of plague in the Eastern camp, pressure from other rebellions, or divine intervention, the lifting of the siege preserved the city and allowed the southern realm to survive the crisis that had destroyed so many other liberation movements. The tribute payment that the king made to secure peace demonstrated both the costs of opposition and the pragmatic compromises necessary for survival. Eastern records document the enormous wealth extracted from the southern kingdom: 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, and various luxury goods, including ivory, ebony, and precious stones. This tribute represented a significant portion of the realm's accumulated wealth and required substantial taxation to satisfy Eastern demands. The aftermath of the crisis revealed the complex legacy of the liberation movement. The southern realm had survived while maintaining formal independence, demonstrating that skilled diplomacy and preparation could achieve limited success against Eastern pressure. However, the economic costs were enormous, territorial losses were significant, and the kingdom's international position was weakened by the demonstrated limits of its capabilities. Manasseh's long reign, following his father's death, brought a fundamental reversal of policies that had characterized the opposition period. The new king, faced with the reality of Eastern dominance and the costs of confrontation, chose accommodation over defiance. His policies represented not merely personal preference, but recognition that survival required adaptation to Eastern realities, rather than futile attempts to restore complete independence. The spiritual changes implemented during Manasseh's reign reflected the cultural pressures accompanying submission. Foreign practices were reintroduced as diplomatic necessities. Local shrines were rebuilt to serve populations who found centralized worship inconvenient or insufficient. The syncretistic practices that his father had eliminated returned as expressions of both Eastern pressure and popular spirituality that differed from official temple orthodoxy. The reaction against Manasseh's policies built gradually throughout his 45-year reign, as traditionalists, prophetic voices, and nationalists developed alternative visions for the realm's future. Underground movements preserved Hebrew texts and traditions while planning for future restoration of independence and spiritual purity. The tension between accommodation and defiance would shape development throughout the remainder of the monarchical period. Archaeological evidence from the capital during this period reveals both the prosperity that accommodation brought and the cultural changes that accompanied Eastern integration. Luxury goods from throughout the Eastern system appear in elite residences. Administrative buildings reflect expanded governmental functions. However, artifacts show the spiritual syncretism that traditional voices condemned as apostasy from covenant obligations. The assassination of Manasseh's son, Amon, after only 2 years on the throne, demonstrated the depth of opposition to accommodationist policies. The conspiracy involved court officials who represented traditional values that had been suppressed during the long period of Eastern collaboration. However, the swift popular reaction against the assassins showed that accommodation had also gained significant support among populations who valued stability over independence. Josiah's accession as a young king created opportunities for dramatic policy reversals that would define the southern realm's final phase of independence. The new ruler's minority provided a window for regent figures who represented traditional values and nationalist aspirations. As the king matured, he would implement the most extensive spiritual changes in Hebrew history, while attempting to restore territorial control that had been lost during previous generations. The international situation during Josiah's reign offered unprecedented opportunities for independence, as the empire that had dominated the region for over a century entered terminal decline. Babylonian rebellion in the east, Scythian invasions from the north, and internal succession disputes weakened eastern control throughout the western territories. The southern mountain kingdom found itself with greater freedom of action than any ruler had enjoyed since the previous century. The discovery of legal texts during temple renovation provided the spiritual justification and popular authorization for Josiah's transformation program. These documents, emphasizing covenant obligations and spiritual purity, became the foundation for policies that eliminated foreign influences while centralizing worship in the capital. The changes represented both genuine conviction and shrewd strategy for building popular support for restored independence. The destruction of regional shrines throughout the realm eliminated practices that had developed during the period of Eastern accommodation. Local priests were brought to the capital, centralizing authority while ensuring royal control over spiritual institutions. The Passover celebration of 622 BC, described as unprecedented in its scale and significance, demonstrated popular enthusiasm for the spiritual restoration that accompanied independence. Territorial expansion accompanied spiritual transformation as Josiah's forces moved into former northern territories that Eastern weakness had left inadequately defended. The destruction of the shrine at Bethel symbolically eliminated the spiritual justification for the ancient partition, while practically extending southern control over areas that had remained under foreign administration since the northern realm's destruction. The Battle of Megiddo in 609 BC brought this period of renewed independence to a tragic conclusion, when Josiah's attempt to prevent Egyptian forces from supporting the weakening empire resulted in the king's death and the southern realm's return to foreign vassalage. The loss of the transforming king eliminated the leadership that had achieved remarkable success in restoring spiritual purity and territorial independence during a brief window of Eastern weakness. The reign of Jehoiakim marked the beginning of the final crisis that would lead to the southern realm's destruction. The new king, installed by Egyptian authority after his predecessor's brief rule, faced the impossible task of satisfying competing demands while maintaining domestic stability. The rise of Babylon as the region's new dominant power created additional pressures that the weakened kingdom could neither oppose nor accommodate successfully. As the 7th century BC concluded, the southern mountain kingdom stood at the threshold of its final test. The transformations of Josiah had strengthened identity and popular cohesion while demonstrating the continued vitality of Hebrew traditions. However, the emergence of Babylonian power in the east created new pressures that would prove even more challenging than the threats that previous generations had faced and ultimately survived. The death of Josiah at Megiddo shattered the brief renaissance that had restored Hebrew independence and spiritual renewal during the final decades of the 7th century. With their transforming monarch dead on a distant battlefield, the people of the southern realm faced a crisis that would test every institution, tradition, and belief that had sustained them through 4 centuries of monarchical rule. The Babylonian colossus rising in the east would prove far more devastating than any previous threat, bringing not merely political subjugation, but the complete destruction of the temple, the monarchy, and the homeland itself. Jehoahaz's brief 3-month reign demonstrated the southern kingdom's complete loss of autonomy in regional affairs. Pharaoh Necho, returning victorious from his campaign to support the dying Eastern Empire, deposed the new king and installed his brother Jehoiakim as an Egyptian vassal. The enormous tribute demanded 100 talents of silver and 1 talent of gold drained the royal treasury while demonstrating the realm's reduced status from independent kingdom to contested prize between competing foreign powers. Jehoiakim's 11-year rule coincided with the most dramatic geopolitical transformation in Near Eastern history, as forces from Mesopotamia systematically destroyed the remnants of Eastern dominance and established a new order throughout the region. The southern mountain kingdom found itself caught between Egyptian overlords who demanded loyalty and tribute, and armies that swept westward with unstoppable momentum, eliminating every obstacle to their expanding control. The Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC marked the decisive moment when Nebuchadnezzar's forces crushed Egyptian power in Syria-Palestine, establishing Mesopotamian hegemony over territories that had been contested for generations. The young prince, soon to become king himself, pursued the fleeing Egyptian army to the very borders of Egypt, demonstrating that the new empire possessed both the capability and determination to control the entire Levantine corridor. Jehoiakim's submission to Mesopotamian overlordship represented pragmatic calculation rather than willing allegiance. The southern king understood that opposition to the new power would bring immediate destruction, while accommodation might preserve some measure of autonomy for his devastated realm. The tribute payments and diplomatic submission that followed demonstrated both the kingdom's weakness and its rulers' desperate attempts to navigate between submission and survival. The first deportation of 597 BC began when Jehoiakim's son Jehoiachin attempted to rebel against Mesopotamian control after only 3 months on the throne. Nebuchadnezzar's swift response demonstrated the efficiency of Eastern administration and the futility of rebellion against the new empire. The young king, along with the queen mother, court officials, commanders, and thousands of skilled craftsmen, was transported to distant captivity in chains, the first wave of what would become the defining trauma of Hebrew history. The Chronicle provides precise dating for these catastrophic events. In the 7th year, in the month of Kislev, the king mustered his troops and marched to the land of Hatti. He besieged the city of Judah, and on the 2nd day of the month of Adar, he seized the city and captured the king. This clinical record barely hints at the human devastation accompanying the capital's surrender and the systematic removal of its most capable inhabitants. Zedekiah's installation as the final king represented Mesopotamian confidence that puppet rulers could maintain order while ensuring tribute payments and loyalty. The new monarch, uncle to the deported Jehoiakim, inherited a realm stripped of its leadership, wealth, and most skilled population. The kingdom that had once rivaled northern powers in prosperity and cultural achievement now consisted largely of peasant farmers struggling to maintain basic agricultural production. The psychological impact of the first deportation created profound theological and social crises that challenged every assumption about divine protection and covenant relationship. Traditional beliefs held that God would never permit the destruction of the temple or the removal of the chosen people from their promised land. Yet the reality of conquest forced painful reconsideration of fundamental theological principles that had sustained Hebrew identity for centuries. The prophet's ministry during this period reflected both the spiritual crisis and the practical challenges facing the devastated community. His letters to the displaced population in distant lands urged them to build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, while maintaining hope for eventual return. This advice recognized that the displacement would last longer than most expected, while encouraging cultural preservation through adaptation rather than despair. The prophet's controversial counsel to submit to Mesopotamian authority created intense opposition from nationalist factions who viewed accommodation as apostasy and cowardice. His symbolic actions, wearing a yoke to represent foreign domination, purchasing land during the siege to demonstrate confidence in future restoration, challenged popular expectations while offering alternative frameworks for understanding divine purpose in apparent catastrophe. Conquest devastated urban centers throughout the southern realm. Destruction layers at numerous sites show intensive burning and deliberate demolition of defensive walls and public buildings. The systematic nature of this destruction indicates coordinated policy rather than random warfare, reflecting Eastern determination to eliminate any basis for future rebellion. The economic collapse accompanying conquest created social upheaval that affected every aspect of daily life. International trade networks that had connected the Mountain Kingdom to Mediterranean and Mesopotamian commerce disintegrated. Craft production declined as skilled artisans were deported or fled. Agricultural productivity suffered as farmers were conscripted for forced labor or military service. The prosperity that had characterized Josiah's reign vanished within a generation. Zedekiah's growing desperation led to increasingly desperate attempts to restore independence through alliance with Egypt and coordination with other rebellious vassal states. The king's secret negotiations with Pharaoh Hophra violated his oath of loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar, while offering little realistic hope for successful liberation. These diplomatic maneuvers reflected both the impossibility of permanent submission and the futility of effective opposition to Babylonian power. The final rebellion that began around 589 BC represented the southern realm's last gamble for independence, undertaken despite clear awareness of the likely consequences. Zedekiah's decision to join a coalition of rebellious states reflected popular pressure, elite desperation, and perhaps genuine belief that divine intervention might accomplish what human effort could not achieve. The king understood that failure would bring complete destruction, yet felt compelled to attempt liberation despite overwhelming odds. Nebuchadnezzar's response to this final act of defiance demonstrated both personal anger at what he viewed as oath-breaking treachery and strategic determination to eliminate the source of chronic instability in his western territories. The Babylonian siege of the capital, beginning in January 588 BC, represented not merely military operations, but a campaign of total destruction designed to end Hebrew independence permanently. The siege techniques employed against the capital combined technological sophistication with psychological warfare intended to break both physical defenses and popular morale. Earthwork ramps enabled siege engines to approach the massive walls that had protected the city for centuries. Encircling fortifications prevented supplies from reaching the desperate population within. The systematic approach reflected centuries of Mesopotamian experience in reducing fortified positions through sustained pressure rather than costly direct assault. The duration of the siege, lasting nearly 2.5 years, testified both to the strength of the capital's defenses and the determination of its defenders. Famine conditions developed as food supplies dwindled and the surrounding countryside remained under Babylonian control. Jeremiah's accounts describe horrific scenes of starvation that drove desperate inhabitants to cannibalism and abandonment of traditional moral restraints. Yet the city's resistance continued, despite these unimaginable sufferings. The brief lifting of the siege when Egyptian forces approached created false hopes that international intervention might succeed where local defiance had failed. However, the rapid Babylonian victory over Egyptian relief forces demonstrated both the futility of foreign assistance and the systematic nature of Nebuchadnezzar's campaign. The resumption of the siege eliminated any remaining illusions about possible salvation through human agency. Ezekiel's visions during this period, received while the prophet lived among the earlier deportees in Babylon, provided theological interpretation of the unfolding catastrophe that challenged traditional assumptions about divine protection and covenant loyalty. His symbolic actions, lying on his side for extended periods, eating bread baked over human waste, shaving his head and dividing his hair, dramatized both the coming destruction and the spiritual causes that had made it inevitable. The prophet's vision of divine glory, departing from the temple, provided theological explanation for military defeat that preserved belief in divine power, while acknowledging human failure to maintain covenant obligations. This interpretation allowed the exiled community to understand their suffering as divine judgment rather than divine weakness, preserving hope for eventual restoration while accepting responsibility for current catastrophe. The final assault on the capital began in the summer of 586 BC, when forces breached the weakened walls and poured into the city that had withstood siege for over 2 years. Fire swept through residential and administrative districts, indicating systematic destruction rather than accidental damage. The conquest's thoroughness reflected Eastern determination to eliminate any possibility of future rebellion. Zedekiah's attempted escape during the final assault ended in capture and brutal punishment that eliminated the Davidic dynasty's political authority, while providing a terrible example for other potential rebels. The king's sons were executed before his eyes. Then his own eyes were put out before he was transported to Babylon in bronze shackles. This calculated cruelty served both personal vengeance and political intimidation, demonstrating the costs of defying Babylonian authority. The destruction of Solomon's temple represented the most traumatic aspect of the capital's fall, eliminating the central institution of Hebrew worship, while challenging fundamental theological assumptions about divine presence and protection. Babylonian forces systematically dismantled the bronze pillars, sacred vessels, and architectural elements, transporting valuable materials to Babylon while reducing the magnificent structure to rubble and ash. The symbolic significance of the temple's destruction exceeded even its religious importance, representing the complete elimination of the institutional framework that had sustained Hebrew civilization for 4 centuries. The building that had embodied divine presence among the chosen people now lay in ruins, its treasures decorating foreign temples while its priesthood faced exile or death. The catastrophe forced fundamental reconsideration of every assumption about divine purpose and covenant relationship. The second deportation, following the capital's destruction, removed most of the remaining population that possessed any education, skill, or leadership potential. Nebuchadnezzar's commander, Nebuzaradan, supervised the systematic identification and removal of priests, scribes, military officers, and craft workers whose expertise might contribute to future rebellion, or whose absence would prevent effective reorganization of resistance movements. Contemporary records suggest that approximately 4,600 people were deported during this second wave, though this figure likely represents only heads of households rather than total population transferred to Babylonian territories. The deportees included the surviving members of the royal family, temple personnel, skilled artisans, and military officers, essentially everyone whose education or expertise made them valuable to Babylonian administration or dangerous as potential resistance leaders. The appointment of Gedaliah as Babylonian governor over the devastated territory represented an attempt to maintain minimal administrative control while preventing complete economic collapse. This member of a prominent administrative family possessed both the skills necessary for provincial governance and the political connections that might enable collaboration between Babylonian authorities and surviving Hebrew populations. Gedaliah's brief administration from Mizpah demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of accommodation with Babylonian rule. His policies encouraged agricultural recovery, welcomed refugees returning from neighboring territories, and attempted to rebuild basic governmental functions under foreign oversight. For a few months, it appeared that some form of Hebrew autonomy might survive within the Babylonian provincial system. The assassination of Gedaliah by Ishmael, a member of the royal family who viewed collaboration as treason, eliminated the last hope for peaceful coexistence with Babylonian authority. This act of nationalist violence triggered Babylonian retaliation that completed the destruction of Hebrew political organization, while driving the final remnants of the population into Egyptian exile or complete submission to foreign administration. The flight of surviving leaders and their followers to Egypt, despite Jeremiah's warnings against abandoning the homeland, represented the final dissolution of Hebrew political organization in Palestine. These refugees, carrying the aging prophet with them against his will, established communities in the Nile Delta that would maintain some connection to Hebrew traditions while adapting to yet another foreign environment. The third deportation, mentioned in later sources, likely refers to Babylonian retaliation for Gedaliah's murder and the continuing unrest that plagued the devastated territory. The removal of another 745 individuals in 582 BC eliminated most remaining leadership potential, while demonstrating continued Babylonian determination to prevent any resurgence of Hebrew independence or organized resistance. The transformation of the Promised Land from independent kingdom to sparsely populated Babylonian province represented one of ancient history's most complete political and cultural destructions. Surveys of the Promised Land reveal dramatic population decline throughout the former kingdom, with many sites completely abandoned and others reduced to small agricultural settlements, lacking any urban characteristics or defensive capabilities. Yet even in this apparent finality, the seeds of renewal were already taking root among the exiled communities in Babylon, where Hebrew scribes, priests, and sages began the intellectual and spiritual work that would eventually enable their people's return and renewal. The destruction of the earthly kingdom had paradoxically created conditions for the development of new forms of religious and cultural identity that would prove more durable than any political institution. The theological revolution, forced by exile and destruction, challenged every assumption about the relationship between divine favor and political success, between covenant loyalty and territorial possession, between religious practice and temple worship. Out of this crisis would emerge new understandings of divine purpose that could survive the loss of homeland, monarchy, and temple, while maintaining hope for eventual restoration and renewal. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of the capital and the last Hebrew exiles disappeared into Babylonian captivity, the 4th-century experiment in monarchical government had ended in apparent complete failure. Yet the cultural and religious traditions developed during this period had been preserved in the memories and writings of the scattered survivors, creating the foundation for an extraordinary story of preservation, adaptation, and eventual return that would reshape both Hebrew identity and human understanding of the relationship between faith and political power. The news traveled swiftly through the scattered settlements across the Mesopotamian heartland. Babylon had fallen to an unexpected conqueror from the eastern mountains. In a single night during October 539 BC, Cyrus the Great had achieved what seemed impossible, capturing the greatest city in the world without a battle. For the displaced population who had spent 2 generations adapting to life in foreign lands, this stunning reversal of fortune represented the first glimmer of hope that they might one day see their homeland again. Cyrus represented a completely different model of governance than the harsh overlordship that had characterized Mesopotamian rule for centuries. Where previous empires had sought to eliminate local identities through deportation and cultural suppression, the new approach emphasized tolerance and revival as tools for creating stable, productive provinces. The Eastern Emperor understood that loyal subjects served imperial interests better than rebellious populations, making cultural accommodation a pragmatic policy rather than mere benevolence. The Cyrus Cylinder, composed shortly after the conquest, proclaimed the new ruler's revolutionary approach to governing diverse populations. I gathered all their former inhabitants and enabled them to return to their habitations. I also brought back to their places the gods of Sumer and Akkad, whom Nabonidus had brought into Babylon. For the displaced population, this policy represented unprecedented opportunity. Unlike previous conquerors who had viewed distinctive practices as threats to imperial unity, the new administration saw local traditions as valuable assets that could strengthen provincial loyalty when properly supported. The return of displaced peoples to their ancestral lands would demonstrate imperial benevolence while creating grateful client populations throughout the vast realm. Sheshbazzar emerged as the first leader of the revival movement, bearing both royal lineage as a son of the deposed King Jehoiakim and Eastern authorization to begin the journey homeward. The initial group that departed Mesopotamia around 538 BC consisted primarily of spiritual enthusiasts and nationalist idealists who possessed both the resources for the dangerous journey and the motivation to abandon established lives for an uncertain future in a devastated homeland. The biblical account preserves detailed lists that reveal the careful organization underlying what might appear to be spontaneous migration. Sanctuary personnel, including priests, Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, formed the largest contingent, reflecting the spiritual motivations driving the movement. Skilled craftsmen, particularly those with experience in construction and metalworking, represented crucial human resources for rebuilding projects. Notable families from various tribes maintained their genealogical records, preserving tribal identities that had survived 2 generations of displacement. The journey from Mesopotamia to Palestine presented enormous challenges that tested both Eastern administrative capabilities and determination among the displaced. The 1,000-mile route across desert and mountain terrain required careful planning, adequate supplies, and protection from nomadic raiders who preyed on defenseless travelers. Imperial officials provided both authorization documents and practical support, demonstrating commitment to the revival policy despite its considerable costs. The first sight of the devastated homeland must have shocked even those who had prepared themselves for destruction. The magnificent sanctuary that had been the pride of civilization lay in ruins, its massive stones scattered, and its sacred vessels long since melted down or carried away to foreign shrines. The capital itself had become a shadow of its former glory, with broken walls, collapsed buildings, and sparse population struggling to maintain basic agricultural production. Zerubbabel's assumption of leadership marked a new phase in the revival movement, as this grandson of King Jehoiakim brought both royal legitimacy and practical administrative experience to the enormous challenges facing the returned population. Unlike Sheshbazzar, whose role had been primarily symbolic, Zerubbabel possessed the skills necessary for negotiating between Eastern authorities, local populations, and the diverse groups that comprised the rebuilding effort. The decision to prioritize sanctuary reconstruction reflected both spiritual conviction and practical calculation. The settlers understood that without a central place of worship, their scattered settlements would gradually assimilate into surrounding populations and lose their distinctive identity. Moreover, a rebuilt sacred structure would demonstrate both imperial benevolence and gratitude, creating a visible symbol of successful policy that could encourage similar revivals elsewhere. Opposition to the reconstruction project emerged immediately from populations that had occupied the land during the decades of absence. These groups, including both indigenous peoples who had never been deported and foreign settlers imported during the Mesopotamian period, viewed the returning exiles as unwelcome competitors for limited resources and influence. Their offers to participate in the sacred construction were rejected by the settlers, who feared that allowing participation would compromise the project's spiritual purity. The Samaritans, descendants of the mixed population that had developed in the former Northern Kingdom, represented the most significant opposition to the revival efforts. These groups maintained their own traditions that blended elements with foreign influences, creating theological conflicts with the settlers' emphasis on spiritual purity and exclusive devotion to traditional practices. The rejection of Samaritan participation in reconstruction created lasting hostility between populations that shared common ancestry but divergent development. Construction of the second house proceeded slowly amid constant difficulties that tested the settlers' determination and resources. Material shortages forced builders to use less expensive stones and simpler designs than Solomon's magnificent original. Labor shortages meant that work progressed in fits and starts as farmers had to divide their time between construction projects and agricultural activities necessary for basic survival. Imperial subsidies helped, but could not eliminate the enormous financial burden of major construction projects. The foundation ceremony in 516 BC, marking the sacred building's completion after 20 years of intermittent construction, evoked complex emotions among the assembled population. Younger settlers and their children celebrated enthusiastically, viewing the new structure as evidence of divine favor and achievement. However, elderly priests and Levites who remembered Solomon's sanctuary wept openly, recognizing that the second house, despite its spiritual significance, could never match the glory and magnificence of its predecessor. Haggai and Zechariah's prophetic ministries during this period provided both practical encouragement for the construction project and theological interpretation of the revival's significance. These prophets argued that the new sanctuary, though smaller and less elaborate than Solomon's original, would witness even greater divine glory, through its role in the ultimate renewal of fortunes and the establishment of divine rule over all nations. The disappearance of Zerubbabel from historical records around this time has sparked speculation about imperial concerns regarding messianic expectations surrounding the Davidic heir. Some settlers may have viewed the sacred building's completion as a sign that full independence was imminent, with Zerubbabel as the divinely appointed king who would restore sovereignty. Such expectations would have alarmed Eastern authorities, committed to maintaining imperial control over all provincial territories. The establishment of Yehud as an official province represented both achievement and limitation for the revival movement. On one hand, the population had gained recognized status within the imperial system, with defined boundaries, appointed governors, and authorization to collect taxes for both local needs and imperial tribute. On the other hand, this provincial status made clear that the settlers remained subject peoples whose autonomy existed only at imperial pleasure. Economic development proceeded gradually as the rebuilt settlements adapted to changed circumstances while attempting to rebuild productive capacity. Agricultural productivity slowly increased as terraces were rebuilt, irrigation systems renewed, and new settlements established in previously abandoned areas. However, the province remained economically marginal compared to its pre-destruction prosperity, lacking both the population and the international connections that had once made it a significant regional power. The arrival of Ezra around 458 BC brought new energy and resources to the renewal effort, along with challenges that tested the spiritual and social foundations that had developed during the first century of imperial rule. This priest and scribe came with explicit authorization to implement sacred law and reorganize life according to traditional legal principles that had been preserved and developed during the period of displacement. Ezra's most controversial policy involved the dissolution of marriages between men and foreign women, viewed as compromising the population's spiritual purity and cultural distinctiveness. This dramatic measure affected hundreds of families and created enormous social disruption. Yet it also demonstrated the settlers' commitment to maintaining the exclusive identity that had enabled survival through displacement and return. The public reading of the law during the Feast of Booths represented a pivotal moment in development, marking the transition from a culture based primarily on oral tradition to one centered on written scripture. The ceremony's emotional impact, with listeners weeping as they heard laws they had forgotten or never known, demonstrated both the distance that had developed between the people and their ancestral traditions, and the power of rediscovered identity to transform contemporary life. Nehemiah's arrival in 445 BC as appointed governor brought practical administrative skills and authority that complemented Ezra's spiritual leadership. This royal cupbearer had persuaded the emperor to support an ambitious project for rebuilding the capital's defensive walls, recognizing that physical security was essential for the settlement's long-term survival and development. The wall reconstruction project, completed in an astonishing 52 days, demonstrated both the population's organizational capabilities and the effectiveness of motivated collective action. The rapid completion resulted from careful advance planning, efficient division of labor among family and professional groups, and determination to complete the project despite opposition from neighboring peoples who viewed fortification as a threat to regional stability. Opposition to the wall project came from multiple sources, including Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab, who represented regional power structures that had developed during the period of weakness. These leaders understood that a fortified and prosperous province would challenge their own influence and economic interests, making them natural opponents of any revival that enhanced capabilities. The dedication ceremony for the completed walls marked the culmination of the physical rebuilding process, while emphasizing the spiritual significance that the settlers attached to their rebuilt defenses. The procession around the city's perimeter, accompanied by musical performances and ceremonies, proclaimed both gratitude for imperial support and confidence in divine protection for the renewed settlement. Social and economic changes implemented during Nehemiah's governorship addressed internal problems that threatened cohesion and stability. Debt slavery had become common as poor families mortgaged their lands and children to survive economic hardships, creating a class of dispossessed people who lacked both voice and economic security. Nehemiah's cancellation of debts and return of confiscated properties demonstrated that leadership could address social justice concerns while strengthening solidarity. The Elephantine papyri, discovered in modern times, reveal the existence of a settlement in southern Egypt that maintained its own sanctuary and practices throughout this period. This evidence demonstrates that return to Palestine represented only one option for displaced populations, many of whom had established successful settlements in foreign lands and felt no compulsion to abandon their new homes for an uncertain future in a devastated homeland. The relationship between the Palestinian revival effort and these diaspora populations created new forms of identity that transcended territorial boundaries. Shared traditions, maintained through correspondence and travel, created networks of mutual support and cultural exchange that enriched all settlements while preserving distinctive local adaptations to different environments and circumstances. The canonical process that resulted in the Bible's final form reflected the renewed settlement's need to preserve and transmit the cultural heritage that had enabled survival through displacement, while providing authoritative guidance for contemporary spiritual and social life. Scribal schools carefully copied, edited, and organized traditional materials into collections that would serve both educational and liturgical purposes for future generations. The development of synagogue worship represented another crucial innovation that enabled spiritual life to flourish without dependence on sacrifice and priestly mediation. These local assemblies for prayer, scripture reading, and instruction could be established wherever settlements existed, creating decentralized but unified practice that would prove remarkably adaptable to changing circumstances. The imperial period's contribution to development extended far beyond physical rebuilding to encompass theological innovations that would influence thought for millennia. Concepts of individual responsibility, universal divine rule, and hope for ultimate justice gained prominence during this period, reflecting both the influence of Eastern ideas and the population's efforts to understand their historical experiences within a divine framework. Eastern tolerance created an environment where traditions could develop without external persecution, while engaging with international ideas and practices. This intellectual freedom enabled the synthesis of traditional theology with new concepts derived from various sources, producing the rich theological literature that would become foundational for later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. The transformation of identity from territorial nationalism to portable spiritual culture represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the displacement and return experience. The population that emerged from this process possessed both deeper commitment and greater adaptability than their predecessors, creating forms of cultural identity that could survive subsequent dispersals and persecutions. As the imperial period drew to a close with Alexander's conquests in the late 4th century BC, the renewal effort had achieved remarkable success in preserving and transmitting their cultural heritage, while adapting to radically changed circumstances. The sanctuary had been rebuilt, the walls had been renewed, sacred law had been established, and institutions had been created that would enable survival through future challenges. Yet the legacy of the ancient kingdoms extended far beyond the specific population that had returned to Palestine. The spiritual and cultural traditions developed during 4 centuries of monarchical rule, preserved through displacement and renewed during return, had created intellectual and spiritual resources that would influence human civilization for millennia to come. The memory of David's kingdom would inspire messianic hopes that shaped Jewish, Christian, and Islamic expectations of ultimate divine rule. The legal traditions preserved in Scripture would provide foundations for ethical systems throughout the Western world. The literary achievements of the monarchical period would become part of humanity's common cultural heritage through translation and transmission across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The prophetic tradition that had emerged during the kingdom's struggles with imperial powers would continue to provide resources for understanding the relationship between divine will and human history. The theological innovations developed in response to displacement and return would offer frameworks for comprehending suffering, hope, and renewal that would prove relevant to countless later populations facing similar challenges. Most profoundly, the transformation of identity from tribal confederation to territorial kingdom to spiritual fellowship demonstrated the possibility of cultural survival and renewal even after apparent complete destruction. The story of how a small mountain kingdom's traditions could survive conquest, displacement, and return to become foundational elements of world civilization would itself become a source of hope and inspiration for peoples facing their own struggles for survival and renewal. As the sun set on the imperial period and new powers prepared to reshape the ancient Near East once again, the settlements scattered across the known world possessed both the cultural resources and the institutional structures necessary for preserving their distinctive identity through whatever challenges the future might bring. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah had ended, but their legacy would endure as long as human beings sought to understand their relationship with the divine, their obligations to their neighbors, and their hope for ultimate justice and peace.